One of the most important issues that we need to discuss, getting into the period that we call the early Middle Ages, and we're still to some extent in late antiquity here, so we're talking 6th, 7th, maybe early 8th century, is the exposure to the Germanic peoples, of the Germanic peoples, I should say, to Christianity. And their eventual conversion. Rome began the process of conversion and Christianization, really with the acceptance of Constantine the Great of the religion. And there were some Germanic peoples who were converted to Christianity fairly early. For the most part, this was through Arian Christianity. I noted that both the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths were Arian Christians, and they helped to perpetuate the existence of that, what was deemed by the Orthodox and Catholic adherents as a heresy. But there were many Germanic peoples who were not converted to Christianity. This included, as of the time of the Ostrogoths, and so this included the Franks. It also included the Anglo-Saxons. A lot of the chronicles that are written during this period document, I should say, maybe not a lot, but several important chronicles document and describe the conversion of these Germanic peoples to Christianity. For the most part, they talk about the kings being converted, usually through miraculous means, but there are some other things that we need to take into account that seem to have been factors in conversion. The other major source for conversion, these conversion stories, are the lives of saints who did the missionizing or the proselytizing to the Germanic peoples. And many of these missionary saints were Irish. They were originally from the British Isles, and especially from Ireland. They went to the continent, fired with a zeal for Christianity, and helped to spread Christianity there. And so you might think that it's strange to find a German saint, for instance, named Kilian, which is an obviously Irish or Gaelic name, or even a Saint Columban. But that's because these are Irish, or at least ostensibly Irish missionaries who went to the Germanic peoples. Whether these are actual historical figures or not is unknown, because the stories about them, the sources about them, are these saints' lives, which of course are very stylized. And so saints' lives are really important pieces of information that we can draw from, even though we have to, we can't treat them as unadulterated accounts of history. We have to recognize that there are reasons why these things are written. There are a couple of we can break this down to this process of the conversion to Christianity really into two parts. The first of these is the initial wave of evangelization. That means, the missionaries going to these peoples and exposing them to Christianity, and the initial conversion phase of this. And the chronicles tend to sort of tell the story of the conversion of the kings, even though, the king converting is not necessarily a sign that everyone is converted to the religion. That at least makes it, we might say, official as the religion of the people. And two of the sources that I gave you to read for this week, actually one of them was assigned for week 1, were the stories about the conversions of Clovis in Gregory of Tours, and the conversion of King Ethelbert. That's spelled Ethelbert, I believe, in the Giri, but it's actually pronounced Ethelbert if we go with the Anglo-Saxon. But in any case, it doesn't really matter. But the conversion of Ethelbert of Kent to Christianity in the work of Bede. And so I want to look at those sources a little bit, and especially at the role that Gregory the First, who was the Pope in the late 6th century, Gregory was a church doctor, a church father of the same kind of stature as St. Augustine or St. Jerome. In fact, he's included in the 4 Latin doctors of the Church, along with those 2 in St. Ambrose. But of the 4, he was the only one who actually became pope, and his strategy for converting people and for spreading Christianity is an important factor in this whole story. And so we want to take a look at that briefly. But we also need to note that the initial wave of the spread of Christianity is only a first step in a long process that we might call Christianization. And this, of course, is not unique to Christianity. We find the same phenomena in existence whenever there's a spread of a major religion into a new area. We find it with the spread of Islam. We find it certainly with the spread of Buddhism in the ancient world, or maybe even other religions, right? That there's the initial phase of conversion where people get interested in this. And then there's the long process of the cultural change that goes on as the religion takes root in the fundamental aspects of the society. And that takes generations, if not centuries, to bring about. It's not like, all of a sudden somebody says, okay, we are fully Christian now, right? We have to be careful documenting this in sources to say, all right, in this source, in this period, we can see the presence of Christianity in these ways, and then we begin to see it becoming a little more intrinsic to the baseline culture as time goes on, and then eventually, we can say this area is fully Christianized, because, these are the evidences. And what I normally do with students in the classroom is say, okay, what evidence would there be that a land has become Christian? And often they come up with, well, there would be churches, and that is true. Actually, Europe is not, we might say, covered with churches until probably the 10th or even 11th century. And so that's something that takes a long time. A lot of people were ostensibly Christian, or at least superficially Christian, without having any access to a church nearby. That they might visit a church only once or twice in their lives, even, or maybe never. And so, the massive building program of the 11th century is a long way off, and we'll talk about that when we get to that point in the chronology. Another piece of evidence you might not think of is names, right? You can see that, names like Athelbert, these are very Germanic, very traditionally Germanic. When the kings or at least the people of these lands stop naming their children things like Athelbert and Chlodeweg, and they start naming their children Thomas or Peter or John, or the daughters Maria or something like that, right, or Mary, then Christianity really has taken root, and we can say that the process of Christianization has largely run its course. One that we'll look at are laws. You can find this in legal material, where Christianity becomes a protected element of society, and the law itself is based on the tenets of the religion. That's, we can tell that's a real mark of Christianization, when the whole, the basic assumptions, the basic legal situations are informed by Christianity, and they really lie at the root of the laws. Okay, so I want to take a look at some sources now to discuss this. And the first one I want to go to is this one by Gregory of Tours called The 10 Books of Histories. I'm only going to look at a couple of passages from this. This is a rather long and detailed and often grisly account of the deeds, this section at least, of Clovis, who I mentioned in one of the last lectures as being the one who really kind of solidified the Merovingian dynasty of the Franks around 500, a few decades after his death. Gregory of Tours, who was an important churchman in the area, wrote an account of this and focused, of course, on Clovis's conversion to Christianity, right? And this is a few pages into the document. Let's see, where is it? Okay, so, it mentions that Clovis's father Childeric died, and he came in, became the king, right? And Clovis was not yet a Christian, okay? And, Gregory goes on to note, at this time many churches were plundered by the troops of Clovis because he was yet fast held in pagan errors. Thus it happened. And then he tells his story about the Bishop of Soissons, which is in central France, kind of a little bit south of Paris. And there is this vessel of some kind. It's called a ewer. I'm not exactly sure what a ewer is, to be honest, but it's some kind of sacred vessel, probably for holding holy water or incense or something like that. And the Bishop of Soissons, this thing has been plundered from his church, and he goes to King Clovis and says, can I, you can keep everything you took from me, but please give me that sacred vessel back, right? And Clovis is impressed with him, and so he goes to his men. Now note that when Clovis goes to his warriors, right, there is this interesting interaction, and this really gets into the kind of warrior ethos of this society. But Clovis says, we've shared the spoils of war here, okay, and he's presiding over, right, the kind of distribution of the goods, okay, and he says to them, I ask you, most valiant warriors, not to refuse to cede me that vessel. And it seems that he wants to take it so that he can give it back to the bishop. Now, why would a pagan king want to give what is probably a pretty valuable item back to the bishop? Well, you might, that could inspire some interesting discussion. One point that we might make there is that Clovis is interested in making allies with people across religious lines. This isn't, this is not to say that his religion is a religion of convenience, but he's trying to solidify his rule in the kingdom, and having potentially powerful allies like Christian churchmen could be to his benefit. But there's a soldier of his, and it seems that Clovis doesn't have, he's not ruling as a kind of dictatorial figure or anything like that. This was not really how this whole Germanic military thing worked. There's a soldier who gets angry at this. He's like, well, you're kind of speaking out of turn here, Clovis. You're supposed to let us take our dibs. And so he picks up his axe and he, chops this vessel in two. He destroys it, right? And Clovis says nothing and kind of goes on his way. And it seems that this is okay, Clovis said this and the men refused, and this is a transaction that people kind of move on from. But later, Clovis, does the same thing to the guy, right? He's doing a military review of his soldiers, and he starts to dress this guy down, saying he's sloppy and everything, and he grabs the guy's axe and throws it on the ground. And as the man bent down to take it up, the king swung his own axe high and cleft his skull, saying as he did it, "Thus did you treat the ewer at Soissons." And so he kills the guy, right, in revenge for what he did to this Christian vessel. And that's an interesting story, and you wonder, why did he put that in there? Well, Gregory may have seen this as a sort of portent for Clovis is already starting to be interested in Christianity. But the key, they're really talking to two keys to Clovis's conversion. One is that he is married to a Christian woman named Clotilde. And Clotilde is actually an orphan who's found, there's a whole story to this in this chapter. I'm not going to take time to read it. And Clovis marries her, right? That she, because, as it says, observing her grace and understanding and learning she was of the royal blood, he then took her and married her, right? And Clotilde, as they're about to have a child, their firstborn child, she wanted the child to be baptized, and Clovis wouldn't allow it. He's like, no, we need to, we're worshiping the gods of my fathers. But then Clovis gets into a scrape, right? He's in a war against these people called the Alemanni, who were a rather short-lived group, it seems, destroyed by the Franks. He is in dire straits in this war, and so he prays to Jesus and says, if you help me with this, I'll convert to your religion, right? I will do what my wife says, and it turns out that, this goes well for him, and so, he then becomes a Christian. Now, importantly, and there's more to the story of Clovis and his Christianity, but I won't take time to review that. Importantly, the last point is that he embraces the Catholic version of Christianity, not the Arian version that the other Germanic peoples had embraced. This is the Catholic version. And so we begin to see an alliance between the Franks and the Catholic clergy of Western Europe, and particularly as time goes on with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And we'll see that kind of come to fruition during the Carolingian period. A second document that I want to look at is the Bede text, and this one goes into a good deal more detail, and so it's this Bede, History of the English Church and People. Okay, this, again, we learn a great deal about, how conversion happens and everything, this is a mission. Let's see, where is it? Yeah, right here. In the year of our Lord 582, Maurice, the 54th from Augustus, ascended to the throne. Notice that this is in the 6th century, and they are still reckoning the year by who is serving as the Roman emperor, right? And so they're saying, this Maurice is the Roman emperor. This, of course, the emperor in Constantinople, and Bede is writing all the way in northeastern England. But he knows exactly who the Roman emperor is because Rome has never died. Rome is still around. And in the 10th year of his reign, Gregory becomes pope, and this is Gregory the Great. Okay, so he sends a mission to the English, and by that we mean the Anglo-Saxons, right? And the person who heads this is a fellow named Augustine. Augustine, this is not Augustine of Hippo, not Saint Augustine. He is a Saint Augustine, but it's a different Saint Augustine than the one we've talked about. This is Augustine of Canterbury. And with the blessing of the Pope, he and some fellow monks take a journey up to the British Isles. They enter the Kingdom of Kent specifically. Kent is on the far southeastern coast. It's really just right across the English Channel from France. The primary city, by the way, of Kent was Canterbury. There's a reason why the most prominent churchman in England from this time on was in Canterbury. That's because this is where the initial conversion happened. But it turns out that the King of Kent, whose name is Ethelbert, he had heard of the Christian religion because he is married to his wife, named Bertha, is of the royal family of the Franks, meaning she is the great-great-granddaughter of Clovis or something like that, right? So the Merovingians had converted roughly a century before. Now they are sending their princesses off to these Germanic peoples to marry, but she had brought with her a Christian bishop named Luithard, another good Germanic name still, and supporting her in the faith. And so in his own household, Ethelbert has a Christian wife and a Christian bishop within his own court. And so naturally, what's he going to say to these missionary monks? Like, no, get out of here. I don't want anything to do with this, right? He's going to do everything he can to please his wife and this bishop and to make sure that he's got a good, strong alliance with the Franks. Now, Bede tries, of course, Bede is a churchman, and he's writing this in the vein of kind of a saint's life, or at least of a sacred chronicle. And he attributes all of this to the way of life of these monks, that, they are able to accomplish miracles because they're just so good and so holy and all of that, right? That's his emphasis, okay? He says here, for instance, in brief, some believed and were baptized, admiring the simplicity of their blameless life and the sweetness of their heavenly doctrine, okay? But if if we get down to it, like, let's be a little cynical about this, perhaps. I don't want to dismiss certainly any, that there is legitimate belief or legitimate conversion going on, because that is a real thing. But why would it be to the advantage of a king like Ethelbert, who is right on the edge of the Anglo-Saxon lands, close to Frankish territory? Why would it be to his advantage to convert to this religion? Well, this, we could say, again, being a little bit cynical, that this is going to pave the way to better economic relations and better, diplomatic relations with the Franks, who are now the most powerful kingdom in the proximity, right? And so Bede says this is all about the holiness of these men and legitimate miracles, that Ethelbert is convinced by the miracles. But there are also advantages that, these monks can read and write. They're literate. They know Latin. And so, that they're offering to found a monastery there and essentially open up a school for people to teach them. This also would be to the great advantage of the Kingdom of Kent. And if they have a strong diplomatic alliance with the Franks, and they've got, the ability to communicate even with people in the Mediterranean, their rivalries with their fellow Anglo-Saxon, with the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, are on their minds, that this is going to help them in sort of fighting the constant wars that were happening between these kingdoms. The other part of this that I wanted to mention, is this letter that Gregory the Great sends to this guy named Abbot Mellitus. This was a go-between, and so he's traveling from Rome to Canterbury. At this point, Christianity has taken hold in Kent, and Gregory has gotten inquiries from Augustine of Canterbury and others about, what do we do in these situations, right? We can tell that this is the Pope responding to that. And so he says, when you get to Augustine, tell him what I have decided, about when Almighty God has led you to the most Reverend Bishop Augustine, our brother, tell him what I have long been considering in my own mind concerning the matter of the English people. To wit, that, and then he goes into these decisions he has made. So the first of these, he says, the temples of the idols in that nation, meaning the religious buildings they have built to worship their pantheon of gods. Now, this is a Germanic pantheon of some kind. It's, the Germanic equivalent of gods like Odin and Thor, who are also in the Norse pantheon. This is a Northern European, Germanic, and Scandinavian phenomenon, right? They would have temples and other things dedicated to these gods. He says, don't destroy the temples, because people are accustomed to going to these places for religious experiences. Instead, sprinkle some holy water and put some altars and relics and things in these places and turn them into Christian churches. And if the people see that their religious sites are not destroyed, they will eventually, just consider themselves Christian, because that's where they're going to go for religion anyway. And he also goes on to say that they've been accustomed to certain kinds of religious festivals. They often hold feasts. This would be on occasions like at the winter solstice, for instance, or probably the equinox, the Germanic holy days, in this traditional religion tended to be associated with kind of seasonal things. They probably had a harvest festival of some kind. They had a midsummer sort of festival. And so, they're used to getting together and having big feasts. Well, we need to substitute something for them. And so let's create, on Christian holy days, let's hold feasts like they're accustomed to holding. You can see from this is the strategy of Gregory. It's like, let's not do a kind of wholesale clearing or destruction of the culture. Let's let them retain some of the trappings of the culture. We will just replace the foundational elements, right? We will now, say that we're worshiping Jesus instead of worshiping Thor or Odin when we hold these festivals. But it's also easy to see why European culture becomes such an amalgamation of Christian and Germanic elements. And this is also true for Roman things, and that the Christianization of Rome happened sometime before, but we talked about this already, that those things merge. Well, many Germanic traditions end up kind of converging on this, right? Just some examples. So there was a spring fertility festival held in the kind of Germanic calendar, and that was dedicated to the Germanic fertility goddess named Eustra, or Easter, and that's actually where the name Easter comes from. And fertility symbols ended up in the practice of Easter, right? Things like eggs in particular. And this is the same for things like evergreen imagery, which would be used at solstice time. That becomes part of the celebration of Christmas. Terms like Yule were associated with Winter Solstice Festival. They then become, kind of Christian terms, and specifically having to do with Christmas. And so, Gregory's strategy leads to a blending of these cultural traditions. Okay, the last, I just wanted to look at two more documents very, very briefly. These were not assigned, but I think that they're demonstrative anyway. These are laws. I mentioned that laws are really good pieces of evidence for the process of Christianization, right? So let's look at this one called the Laws of Ethelbert, and then we will look at the dooms of King Alfred. These are legal materials from King Alfred, who reigned in the 9th century. So Ethelbert is in the 6th, early 7th century, and then Alfred is a couple of centuries on, and we'll see that the laws change, in perceivable ways to become much more Christian, right? So, in the Laws of Ethelbert, now this is the first king of the Anglo-Saxons who converts to Christianity. Notice that the first provision is that the church property is protected. But there is not a single other thing in this entire document that has anything to do with the church, with Christianity at all. It's mostly the same kinds of stuff that we saw in the laws of the Salian Franks, which is that if you do something to somebody, there is a monetary amount that gets applied to that, right? If you kill a man in a nobleman's estate, you have to pay 12 shillings. If you lie with a nobleman's serving woman, pay 20 shillings compensation. And you can get into the relative monetary things like you might want to do with this. But the point that I want to make is there's one thing about Christianity, and it's simply the protection of the property of the church. That's it, right? Moving on, though, what was this? See, yeah. So this is Bede. Sorry, Bede goes on for some time here. I might need to go back to the table of contents. Okay, yeah, King Alfred. All right, and we can see here that there's a good deal more blending of Christianity into the laws, right? And so, for instance, right, he talks about excommunication from the church being a punishment for, somebody committing a crime, right? That's a new thing, okay? And even penance being imposed by bishops for people who, do things that are wrong, right? And so, the Christianity, church institutions, all of these things are much more intrinsically bound up with with the legal material here. So here's another one. Whoever steals on Sunday or at Christmas or Easter or on the Holy Thursday and Rogation days, there's a there's a double fine for that, right? Because you did it on a holy occasion. If anyone steals anything in the church, you got to do something here, right? And so, the Christianization of the culture has largely happened at this point. And there's still stuff about Wehrgeld, and there's still some of the earlier things in here, but, there's so much more. We've got the bishop involved in judicial proceedings. There's just so much more to to this legal material that has to do with Christianity, right? And this is from King Alfred of Wessex, who ruled, as it says, from 871 to 899, or at least that's when these laws were prepared. Okay, so I think we've talked through everything I wanted to do this time. We're going to move on and discuss a little more about the Merovingians and also talk about the Byzantine Empire and the spread of Islam a little bit, because we need to be aware of those.